Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. Welcome then to the first of our BCLT events in 2022. At BCLT, we run a program of academic conferences, symposia, and research seminars, in addition to our regular translation workshops, our annual Zebat lecture, and summer school. In fact, we've just launched this year's summer school, so do check us out at bclt.org.uk. Today's event is a book launch for the latest collection edited by my colleague, BJ Epstein. Back in 2017, we launched BJ's Routledge collection, Queer in Translation, and we're delighted to be able to celebrate another of her publications today. The volume we're celebrating today is the collection International LGBTQ Literature for Children and Young Adults, which came out in August last year from Anthem Press in London. And it's co-edited by BJ and by Liz Chapman from Sheffield, who is also able to join us today. Let me just briefly share my screen again to share with you the table of contents of the publication. I hope you can see that. So here's the table of contents of the publication, and as you can see, it covers a very wide geographical sweep from Brazil to Sweden. It has 16 chapters and no fewer than 20 contributors, and several of the chapters are devoted to multinational comparisons as well. So this is the volume that we're celebrating today. There is, for those who are UEA staff and students, the volume is available electronically via the UEA library. Otherwise, do please order it for your institution or your local library. There was on the initial slide a code for you to input when you go to the Anthem Press website, but we'll also momentarily share with you the flyer for the book so that you've got all the details. Now then, BJ and Liz are joined today by no fewer than 5 of the other contributors to the collection. And they are Thaddeus Andraki from Chicago in the USA, Patricia Sarles from New York, Cheeno Marlo Sayuno from Los Baños in the Philippines, also Warnqvist from Stockholm in Sweden, and Andrej from Jesenice in Slovenia. So we have a very international cast for you today, and I should say welcome wherever you are in the world. I know we've had a lot of interest in this event from all over the world. Before I hand over, though, a word about logistical matters for today. We're using the Zoom webinar format. So you have available to you both chat and Q&A buttons. So do please use the chat during the session. If you have a question that you would like to put to any of the panelists, then do please use the Q&A button for that. And that means everyone can see your question, and questions can be upvoted by those who find them particularly pertinent. And it makes it easier for those chairing the Q&A to see which are the questions to ask. So there's going to be a Q&A session at the end, but before that we're going to hear from BJ and Liz and from all of the panelists in turn. So one final thing, if you use social media, then we have a hashtag for you. I'll put that in the chat now, and that's hashtag INTL for international and then LGBTQ. So hashtag INTL LGBTQ is the hashtag for today. And with that, let me hand over to BJ.
Hello, thank you so much, Duncan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you all are in the world. We are so pleased that you're here to join us today. Thank you for coming. So Duncan has told you about the hashtag INTL LGBTQ, and also about the discount code, which is BEPS 20 for a discount. I would just note that, yes, it'd be delightful if you bought the book for your library, your institution, or you asked them to do so. But if any of you write for publications, blogs, websites, and you'd like a review copy, the publisher will send you an ebook. So feel free to get in touch with me or Liz if that's of interest to you. So we'd like to start by thanking you. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Anthem for publishing this book, which we are so proud of. Thank you to the contributors. We have been working on this book since 2016, and we have got a fantastic lineup of contributors in this book. We are so proud of it. Some of the contributors will be speaking today, and some of you are in the audience, and we thank you for all your hard work on the book. We'd also like to thank Alenka Spacal, who is a Slovenian artist who illustrated the image that was in a children's picture book and then allowed us to use it for the cover. We think it's absolutely beautiful. We'd also like to thank everybody who has been reading this book so far. And of course, we'd like to thank the BCLT for hosting it. We just want to acknowledge one sad thing. One of the contributors to the book, Bernat Cormond, sadly passed away shortly before the book was published, and he was never able to see it. So we just want to acknowledge him and his work as both a writer for children and a scholar, and he wrote the chapter on Spain, which is where he was from. And personally, I'd also just like to thank my co-editor, the absolutely lovely Liz, who has been fantastic to work with, and I feel really lucky that we were able to do this book together. So the structure for today is that briefly we're going to tell you a little bit about the background of the book, the impetus for working on it, and then Liz is going to tell you, a little bit more about the project and our overall findings, so the commonalities and the key points that came from the book. Then we're each going to tell you just briefly about our own chapters, and we will have the 5 contributors tell you a little bit about their chapters, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. And of course, I hope many of you are here because you care about children's literature, you care about queer literature, you care about queer literature for children, and we'd love to talk about how we can see more of this work produced around the world, how we can see more of it translated, written in many different languages, and of course made available to young readers. So the reason why Liz and I decided to work on this book is because both of us have read and researched LGBTQ plus literature for young readers for many years. And we also are both translators ourselves, so we have real interests in different languages and cultures. I work primarily from Swedish and Liz works from French. So in 2013, I believe, I published a monograph, a book about English language queer literature for children and young adults. That book was called Are the Kids All Right? Now, that book mostly focused on English language literature, but I did do a little bit of comparative work in it between English and the Scandinavian countries. I then decided to expand that and work on Swedish literature and a bit on Danish and Norwegian as well, more generally in terms of how it depicts queerness. Meanwhile, Liz, who has a background in French literature, had subsequently moved on to work on LGBTQ plus literature and also was working in library services for children and young people. So we both had this real passion for what are children reading? What are they being told about queerness? What are their sort of opportunities to read this kind of literature? And we began to realize that, number one, we weren't seeing that much queer literature for children, especially translated to English. So we saw some stuff that was written in English, not seeing so much from other countries. We also were realizing that we weren't seeing research on queer literature from around the world, particularly in languages other than English. And so we decided that it was time to rectify this absence. And as I said, we started this talking about this in 2016 and putting out the calls for papers. and reaching out to contributors. And here we are, it was published at the end of 2021. So it was about a 5-year process. And I'm going to hand over to Liz now, who is going to tell you a little bit more about kind of the process of the book and what our overall findings were.
Hello everyone, and first of all I'd like to echo BJ in saying thank you so much for being here today. And I'd also like to thank BJ for being such an absolutely marvellous co-editor. I couldn't have asked for a better co-editor. So as BJ mentioned, this book was 5 years in the making, and while this is not necessarily unusual in academic publishing, we do think it's important to acknowledge the amount of time and effort that went into it, both on the part of the contributors and our publisher, Anthem Press. We also think it's important to speak about the fact that academic work doesn't happen in a vacuum that is separate from real life, and other things can impinge on it. So in the course of editing and producing this book, between us we experienced 2 pregnancies, 1 serious long-term episode of hyperemesis gravidarum, 1 birth, 1 emergency surgery for ectopic pregnancy, 1 death of a parent, and then obviously 1 pandemic, to name only a few of the things that happened. So we are particularly pleased that we have come through all that, and we are delighted to see the book finally published, and we'd like to thank everyone who supported us along the way, including of course our respective partners. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the overall findings of the book. Obviously this is going to be very much a whistle-stop overview, but hopefully it will just give you a taster of some of the things that we speak about in the book and some of the contributors cover. As the chapter started to come in, we were surprised by how many commonalities there were, even between countries that were geographically distant and culturally different from one another. So I'm just going to mention a few of those themes now. One of them was the importance of translation in bringing LGBTQ+ stories to different markets. So in many of the countries, a lot of the books published were imports, usually from English. In some cases, for example, such as in India, those books were published in the English language, whereas in several other countries, for example, France and Germany, they were translated into the local language, either from English or occasionally from other languages. Sadly, this is not, or at least not yet, true the other way round, and most of the books discussed in our book haven't yet been translated into English, which of course does speak to the global cultural and linguistic hegemony of English and the ongoing impacts of colonialism. Another finding was self-publishing. A lot of the books were self-published, particularly picture books for younger children. And this, of course, does mirror existing findings from the US and the UK and other English-speaking settings. There did seem to be this particular concern about LGBTQ materials for young children, and it was difficult to know without further research whether that was caution on the part of the publishers in case of a negative reaction, or whether it was concern that they wouldn't sell enough to make money, or perhaps a little bit of both. But I think it is very obvious from some of the research in this book that there is a market for these books. Lastly, another common theme was that of good intentions. So a lot of the books discussed, although by no means all of them, were quite didactic and treated LGBTQ+ identities as an issue, often in a rather heavy-handed way. So they were queer books written and, as I say, sometimes published by queer authors. And while the dedication of those authors and their activism in making these stories available was really impressive, It is also worth noting that in some cases, the text and the illustrations didn't quite match up to what one might expect from the mainstream market, and that in turn can have the effect of ghettoizing the books. However, to finish on a positive note, we clearly are seeing the publication of more books for LGBTQ children and young people, or LGBTQ books for any children and young people, in many, many countries around the world. And as BJ mentioned, we are going to take some time at the end of today's session to explore how we might encourage more authors and illustrators and publishers to produce such works. And I'm now going to hand back to BJ to talk a little bit more about her own chapter in the book.
Thanks so much, Liz. So I wrote about Sweden, and as I said before, this kind of started with my previous monograph, which I'll just show here, Are the Kids All Right? And this, as I said, mostly focused on English language literature. But I had this one section that kind of compared English language books to Northern European books. And it was so interesting to see what was different and what was similar that I felt I had to do more with this. So in my chapter, I look at LGB Swedish YA Lit, and it's important that I explain why it's just LGB and not kind of the whole alphabet soup. And that's, excuse me, because Åsa Warnqvist, who will be speaking in just a few minutes, explores trans lit from Sweden. And so we decided that there was no need for overlap, and we had different approaches and topics, and there was plenty of material anyway. So I just focused on the LGB Swedish YA. And I would say that overall, one of the most surprising findings from this research project was that many Swedish young adult novels implied that nurture, as opposed to nature, or as opposed to a combination of nature and nurture, is what causes people to become queer. So I would say that nowadays many of us have a sense that, queerness is some, you are queer, maybe some things can affect you, your environment or whatever, but there's usually some sort of natural component, perhaps also influenced by nurture. However, a lot of the Swedish books focused on nurture. So there was this idea that if you are queer, it's because you've probably had a bad life. So maybe you had a difficult family situation, maybe, a parent was an alcoholic, maybe you were abused, whether physically or emotionally, maybe you yourself are depressed, perhaps you have experienced sexual violence. There was a lot of sexual abuse and sexual violence in these books, and so on. And these books kind of suggested that you wouldn't be queer otherwise. And I was really surprised, not least because so often we think of Scandinavia as a more liberal place. And I hadn't anticipated that we'd kind of be back a few decades with these views. However, what I would say is that I noticed some changes happening in the most recent of the books, and there was a lot more acceptance of queerness, and that there was more sense of, well, it just is who you are, and you don't have to have had bad experiences. You could have had a lovely family life with really supportive parents. It's not necessarily the case that you were abused in order to be gay, but still, I have to say that overall, I was quite surprised, and perhaps we could even say stunned, by how much negativity there was in so many of these young adult novels from Sweden in regards to queerness. Liz now is going to talk a little bit about her findings in French language literature, and then we are going to move on to some of the other contributors.
Thank you, BJ. So my chapter in the book is on bisexual young adult literature from France. And this was a slightly new direction for me because my previous research had focused primarily on the provision of LGBTQ plus children's and young adult literature in public libraries. But it was also a return to my first love because my first degree was in French literature. So I felt as though a lot of my academic interests, so the French language and queer literature and children's literature had all come together in a way which was very personally satisfying and meaningful. I decided to focus on bi books, firstly, as I'm a bi woman myself, so it was important to me. Secondly, because I think even within the wider canon of scholarly work on LGBTQ plus children's and young adult books, bi books still do sometimes tend to get overlooked. And thirdly, pragmatically, because I thought that there probably wouldn't be very many of them, and so it would provide a manageable corpus to work with. And this did indeed turn out to be the case, which of course is a mixed blessing. It was also something that was quite disappointing. However, I should note that over the past couple of years, more have started to be published, I have noticed. But for the purposes of my chapter, I looked at 7 young adult novels, all published in France between 2013 and 2018. So I identify a number of themes in my chapter that characterize this corpus, and the first one was bisexuality as a problem. It was constructed as a problem in nearly all of the novels in the corpus, and it was a problem for both the bi characters themselves and for those close to them. However, within the very same novels, it was simultaneously erased. So the words bisexual or bisexuality were used very, very rarely, even for characters who were behaviourally bisexual, for example, sleeping with people of different genders. The novels in the corpus also drew quite heavily on common stereotypes of bisexuality, particularly the trope of bi people as confused and the theme of bisexual promiscuity and infidelity. But the final theme was perhaps the most interesting because it's something that I haven't really come across in scholarly work on either French or English queer literature. And this was the depiction of bi people as extremely normal in terms of their visual appearance and their cultural interests, with more in common with mainstream cis-het culture than with gay visual stereotypes. So meanwhile, gay and lesbian characters in the corpus did tend to be more visibly recognisable as queer in contrast to their straight passing bisexual partners. And I concluded that this seemed to be a way of invisibilising a distinct bisexual identity and perhaps insidiously suggesting that bi people are really just straight after all. So overall, I did feel that there was room for improvement in the depiction of bisexuality in French young adult literature at a time when English language titles had, I think, just started to expand the range of depictions available. However, I do think it is worth noting that some of the more recent books that are starting to come through now are better in terms of, firstly, that more of them exist. Secondly, bisexuality is more visible and is named within the books. And thirdly, we are getting a range of more nuanced, interesting depictions now. So I'm interested to look at that more in the future. And right, so I will now turn it over to the contributors. So firstly, I would like to welcome Cheeno, Marlo, Sayuno, who is our contributor from the Philippines. Over to you, Cheeno.
Thank you, Liz. And let me just share a slide so that I have a guide for my presentation. So my chapter in the very beautiful book edited by BJ and Liz focuses on the LGBTQ plus children's literature in the Philippines. And I'm very thankful because the country has been given a space in the international discussions on the topic. I am Cheeno, Marlo, Sayuno, and I'm from the Philippines. So let me start by sharing that last year in 2021, the University Center for Gender and Development of the Philippine Normal University launched a national competition on gender inclusive literature, particularly on empowerment of women and LGBTQIA plus individuals. So there were many categories, including short story for children and poetry for children in English and Filipino. So it was a very exciting competition because the winners in the categories will be published. I was one of the winners for my work. Gusto kong magkini-kini ni Ahil, or Ahil wants to dance the kini-kini. And as a member of the community myself, it's surprising that I started writing storybooks for children in the Philippines in 2013, but it took me so many years to publish a story that has LGBTQ plus theme in it. And I think this is telling of the situation also in the Philippines, because if you see in this timeline, the first story that was published was Ikaklit sa Aming Hardin, or Sunflower in Our Garden. It won in the Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards, which was the biggest literary competition in the Philippines. And then it was self-published. I think Liz mentioned this earlier, that self-publication was previously the way to go if we want to publish contemporary issues, including LGBTQ plus experiences. In 2013, The Fierce and Fabulous Boy in Pink was published. And then it would be in 2018 when more stories would be published, including a project by Mulat Sulat, wherein they had a workshop, and then they had 5 storybooks as products, which are free to download. And then 2019, there were 2 stories in an anthology of radical stories for children by Lampara Books, and then the competition happened in 2021. So if you see in the timeline, which was one of the center of my discussions in my chapter, the LGBTQ plus storybooks in the Philippines was very scarce. And I think this is because of probably creators are afraid themselves to express their stories. And if they were willing to express their stories, publishers were not as welcoming before as they were now. And the effort of the competition by the Philippine Normal University was actually government funded. And right now, we government institutions are very big on gender and development. We have gender and development offices in every government office. And so that's the reason probably why it's a welcome thing right now. But interestingly, the LGBTQ plus representation has been present in our prehistoric and pre-colonial times. So, for example, we have Lakapati, a transgender Tagalog goddess of fertility and agriculture. The Mentefuele Libun of the Teduray tribe, which means one who became a woman. And we also have the Babaylan, which are shamans who are men but dressed as women. And then we also have, I mentioned this in the chapter, Bayoguin, which came from the term bayog, which is a species of bamboo in the Philippines. If you think about it, comparing the feminine men with bamboo, which is a representation of strength, is very empowering. But when the Spaniards came, this notion of feminine men become negative, and they were degraded into confused or cowardly. In the 1990s Manila, we already have cross-dressers present to entertain people. And then our first Pride March happened in 1994 and also in 1995. But at that time, only the gays and lesbians were represented. But actually, this has become a tradition right now. Before the pandemic happened, there would be annual Pride Marches here in the Philippines. So looking at that, there is a great presence of the LGBTQ plus experiences in the Philippines, and there are interestingly there were only a few in when it's translated into children's literature. So here were the stories that I analyzed for the anthology. So here is Ikaklit sa Aming Hardin, Ikaklit is Sunflower, which is a story of a girl with two mothers. Ang Bonggang-Bonggang Batang Becky, or The Fierce and Fabulous Boy in Pink, which is a story of a flamboyant boy, but the story is being told from the perspective of the heterosexual brother. And then this was the Mulat Sulat project. Mulat means to be awakened, and Sulat means to write. They had the workshop, and they had 5 storybooks as output. So these are various stories that told about being, for example, si Chow Chow is story of a dog who was effeminate but wanted to be a carpenter, and so on. And then Dalawa Ang Daddy ni Billy, or Billy Has Two Daddies, is a story of Billy who has two fathers, as different from Ikaklit, with wherein there are two mothers. And then ang tatay ni Clara and ang nanay ni Erwin is a flip book kind of storybook, wherein there are 2 stories. If you flip to the other side of the storybook, there's another story, and then the 2 stories meet in the middle. And then the last one was my family. Actually, this does not specifically focus on LGBTQ plus experience. Although, if you look at, this is a board book and it's cut in half. So when you flip the pages, you can mix and match the kinds of family. So you can have two fathers and 2 mothers mixed with 1 child, and so on. So what were my findings in the chapter that I wrote? So first, definitely we need more stories on LGBTQ plus experiences for children in the Philippines, because I think, well, after the book was published, there were more, and also there were stories in regional languages. But I think that we need more stories to represent LGBTQ plus experiences. And also, we need, as writers, we need to face the challenge head on, because I noticed that in the stories, the writers tend to tiptoe around the issues. They don't really address the realities of the LGBTQ plus experience. We also need stories wherein the LGBTQ plus characters are the main characters, because as you saw in the previous slides, the storybooks actually have a child with 2 mothers. So the child is not the one who is a member of the LGBTQ plus community. We also want to call for courage from creators, because we hope that writers, illustrators, and publishers in the Philippines and even around the world would produce more LGBTQ plus stories. We hope that as writers, we can write our own stories. As illustrators, we can help in the process and also tell our stories. But we also hope that publishers would be more open in accepting and publishing the stories, because I think as compared to Western countries, self-publishing is very difficult in the Philippines. And lastly, we hope that the stories would further represent the spectrum, because sometimes the represented ones are lesbians and gay people, and father who is effeminate, mother who is manly, but we are yet to represent other individuals within the spectrum and the fluidity of queerness and all. So these were only some of the findings, and you can read more in the chapter that I wrote for the this wonderful anthology. And thank you for listening. I'll turn you over to the next one.
So our next speaker is, I hope that I'm going to pronounce this correctly. Please do correct me if I get it wrong, Andrej. So Andrej Zavrl from Slovenia. So over to you, Andrej.
Yes, thank you very much. The pronunciation was close enough, so thank you. My chapter is an overview of the representations of sexual orientation, gender, and LGBTQ families in fiction for children and young adults, published in Slovenia. In general, I see no reason to describe the analyzed writers and publishers' attempts as anything but well-meaning, but to echo Liz's introductory comment, the road to marginalization is often paved with good intentions, and some texts, paratexts, and criticism still employ different explicit or implicit strategies of othering LGBTQ+ and treating it as a problem or as an issue. My overview focuses on originally Slovenian production, but it includes translated texts too. And since we are at the British Centre for Literary Translation, I'd like to say a few very basic things about the role of translation. Slovenian literature, with only about 2 million speakers of the language, has always relied in various important ways on translation. Today, the share of translated books in the overall book production is roughly 30%. For fiction, poetry, drama, and CYA books taken together, it is about 40%. But if we consider novels for adults only, for example, it is almost 70%. Looking at CYA books published in Slovenia, approximately 40% are translations. And the top 5 source languages in descending order are English, French, German, Spanish, and Italian. English is by far the dominating source language. In 2020, it accounted for 55% of all translated CYA books. In the previous 2 years, the percentage was even higher, 61% in 2019 and 65% in 2018. Most books translated from English make part of literatures where English is the first language, but there is also some indirect translation with English as the intermediate language. In terms of LGBTQ+ literature for children and young adults, translations represent several important firsts for the Slovenian literary system. For instance, the first book clearly intended for teenage readers with homosexuality as the main theme to appear in Slovenia, and the only one to be published before the year 2000, was the translation of Nancy Garden's Any on My Mind. It was published in Slovenia in 1996. The first book with an out gay male adolescent protagonist was Kate Walker's Peter, published in 2007. The first picture book about a family with gay parents was Lawrence Schimmel and Sara Rojo Perez's Friends and Neighbors in 2008. On the other hand, originally Slovenian books contributed to several other important firsts. While Julie Ann Peters' Luna was described by Cart and Jenkins as the first young adult novel to address transsexual, transgender issues, the first young adult novel with a trans protagonist to be published in Slovenia was Susanna Tratnik's My Name is Damian in 2001. It predates Peters' novel by 3 years and its Slovenian translation by 6, but it is true that it was only later recognized and accepted as a young adult novel. Other notable firsts, especially in the genre of picture books by Slovenian authors, are the first picture book on gender roles, expressions, and fluidity by Alenka Spacal, called Rainbow Masquerade. That's the one on the cover of our book. It was published in 2013. The first picture book about same-gender love in the preschool period, First Love, published in 2014. The first picture book about same-gender love in mythology, Achilles and Patroclus, in 2020. And non-fiction, this one, the first LGBTQ+ history book for young readers, Pink Stories for Non-Heteronormative History for the Young, published in 2020. There has been some translation of LGBTQ+ CYA literature from Slovenian into other languages. The two mentioned books, so First Love, has been published into Swedish, Spanish, and Korean, and Tratnik's young adult trans novel, My Name is Damian, has been translated into German, Czech, Slovak, Serbian, Macedonian, and Bulgarian. But interestingly, or ironically, or both, as indicated by Liz in her introduction, although the vast majority of translations into Slovenian are from English, none of these translations are into English. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrej. And it was really nice that we got to see the books as well. So next we are moving to, I'm just going to check to make sure I don't say it wrong, but yes, Ted Andraki, who will be talking to us about Indigenous literature. And you are talking to us from Chicago. So you are the one of the group who has gotten up the earliest this morning. Thanks so much for doing that for us, Ted.
Yes, thanks. So hi, as BJ said, I'm Tad Andraki. I live and work in Chicago, and I think for the context of my chapter, it's important for me to recognize that I live and work on land that was ceded to the United States by the Council of Three Fires, that is the Ottawa, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, and Potawatomi. And this land was also used as a site of home and trade for the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. All of those treaties have also been violated. I wrote the chapter on Indigenous LGBTQ plus / two-spirit literature for young people. And I want to start by talking about that sort of extra word in there, the concept of two-spirit, because if you are unfamiliar with Indigenous writing in settler colonial societies, it's probably a new term. The term two-spirit came about in Winnipeg, Canada in 1990, or that's where it sort of gained some sorts of prominence. The nations that I am talking about, and I am talking specifically about settler colonial nations, so that's the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, cover hundreds of different nations, and all of those nations have different histories surrounding gender and sexuality and cultural approaches to gender and sexuality. And the process of colonialism wreaked havoc on all aspects of these Indigenous people's lives, but very particularly on gender and sexuality, imposing sort of Christian and white and European values on gender and sexuality that really destroyed a lot of that history and also that understanding of people's relationships to themselves, their bodies, and each other. So two-spirit is sort of a term that came out of came out of trying to resist that sort of colonial impetus, that sort of colonial lens of looking at these histories and trying to name them even again from that Eurocentric perspective. It's a term that comes from an Anishinaabe language, and it describes this feeling of having both masculine and feminine souls or spirits within oneself. So it's a term that is deeply connected to culture and deeply connected to spirituality. And it's something that's really comes up when you start investigating this literature, this concept of being unable to disentangle the concept of gender and sexuality from other cultural and historical and sovereign perspectives. So in looking at the literature for young people from these four nations written by Indigenous people, there are a couple of different themes that I talk about in the chapter and that I want to bring up. One of them is just simply the overlapping sort of oppressions faced by LGBTQ plus or two-spirit people. So one of the earliest books in the literature is Killing Darcy by Melissa Lukashenko. She is a Guri writer who works in Australia. And this book really focuses on a side character who is both Aboriginal and gay, and exploring like the navigating society in both of those ways, and recognizing that he is sort of marginalized because of his Aboriginal status, of his race, and because of his sexuality as a gay man. and really seeing both of those things coming together and targeting him in very particular ways. Those things also come up in the North American context too. One of the first books that explores this topic in North American context is Will's Garden by Lee Markle, and this was published in Canada. And also this brings up the theme, I think, of books being published by small publishers. That's definitely something that we've heard of in both Liz's and BJ's discussions. And I think a theme throughout much of the book is the work of small presses or other sort of grassroots work that is trying to get this literature out there. And so in doing this research, I found lots of titles that were coming out from particularly Indigenous focused small publishers that were also publishing some of these books with queer content. And then as like time has progressed and we're starting to see more and more of this literature come out, I'm seeing a lot of speculative fiction, and that's something that I found particularly interesting. So one of those examples is this anthology, Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time. This is also based in Canada, and this is a collection of short stories that are sci-fi focused that also have Indigenous LGBTQ plus characters. And that's a very pervasive theme. There's also Daniel Heath Justice's The Kin Chronicles, there's The Dreamer's Legacy, there's Cherie Demoline's The Marrow Thieves. All of these books use this speculative setting and a sort of this futuristic focus on like reading LGBTQ plus Indigenous peoples into the future, right? Giving them a futurity, which I found very particularly interesting and connects to the concept of survivance, the active continual presence of Indigenous peoples and the forces of colonialism. And then finally, as I was turning this chapter into BJ and Liz, we were starting to see some more sort of a larger growth of this kind of work, and very particularly of the struggles of contemporary LGBTQ plus Indigenous people of different nations. So one of those works is Johnny Appleseed, another Canadian book by Joshua Whitehead that really focuses on a lot of different struggles faced by a young man, sort of the violence that is faced by him, and also the struggles of coming out into communities that have really complicated histories of gender and sexuality. And that's something I also talk about in the chapter, in the ways that colonialism sort of replaced traditional understandings of gender and sexuality with these white and Christian perspectives, and how that became very muddled and messy. In sort of reading and writing about this literature, I think my biggest hope is that by focusing on these very specific cultural and deeply rooted concepts of gender and sexuality, that we can unsettle our sort of broader understandings of gender and sexuality, that these young adult novels cannot be read from a colonial perspective. They cannot be mapped into colonial frameworks, and that helps us participate in the project of decolonization. Not that reading and writing in and of itself are sufficient for decolonization, but they can help draw us the maps to get there. In terms of just further questions in talking about Indigenous and LGBTQ plus literature for young people, there's a couple of things that I think are coming forward. One of them is that I talk about one picture book, Oasis and the World Famous Bannock, in the context of this chapter. But otherwise, most of these titles are for much older readers, sort of the teenage reader. And I think that that's something that I hope to see more progress made in getting Indigenous LGBTQ plus or Two-Spirit literature to younger audiences. And then also, I just want to acknowledge that since this chapter went to press in the past year and a half or so, a large number of titles in this literature have actually been published. There's Ilazzo by Darcy Little Badger, The Boy from the Mish by Gary Lonesborough. We're actually seeing this literature continue to grow, and I think that that's really exciting. This chapter is already in some ways out of date, and I hope that this just continues to bring these questions to the forefront of what does it mean when we try to resist the colonial mapping of gender and sexuality and think of it in a very sovereign place. So I think that's it for me, and I would be happy to take any questions that come up in the chat later on as well.
Thank you so much, Tad. And I really like the sort of positive note there that you ended on, that we're seeing more works published, even in the time between when you submitted the chapter and we published this book. The next speaker is also Warnqvist, and I saw that there was a question in the chat about why we divided Sweden in this way. And so I just thought I'd answer before Åsa spoke, because it's appropriate here. And it was not that there was a clear methodological reason for doing it. It was a very practical reason that Åsa and I both were working in this area, and it was a way of, dividing up our interests, I suppose. And we were each doing sort of different things with Swedish literature, and it seemed simpler to have 2 chapters on it that didn't overlap. But Åsa will tell you more about that. So next up, Åsa Warnqvist.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? I hope so. Right. My contribution to this volume is on transgender narratives, as BJ said, and it's transgender narratives in contemporary Swedish children's and young adult literature. And I look at the history of and the increase and development of contemporary Swedish transgender narratives aimed at children and youth, both of them, and what kind of narratives reach young readers today. The first Swedish transgender narrative, regarded as such by the publisher, libraries, and the media, was published as late as 2013. Of course, it's not really the first one, but the first one marketed as such. From 2013 and up until the time of writing, about 25 books for children and young adults with a transgender protagonist had been published in Swedish, translations and Swedish originals both included. And to this can be added an equally large number of books where transgender characters are depicted as subsidiary characters. And more, of course, has been published since the publication of our book. So I argue that 2 main tendencies can be identified in these narratives. The first one concerns books that function as introducers of the experiences of transgender children and youth. We see an increase in these kinds of books, largely related to the fact that trans lives have become more visible in general in Sweden in the last decade. And the second tendency go beyond this approach by portraying and representing transgender people, but not problematizing them or their experiences. And when it comes to the first category, my analysis focuses on the books as depictions with the aim to explain and make visible the experiences and hardships of transgender children and youth, and the narrative and rhetorical devices used to achieve this. In the chapter, I compare these transgender narratives to Swedish gay narratives, and this comparison makes it clear that problematizing rather than representing is the driving force in the transgender narratives. The stories are characterized by being aesthetic works of fiction with didactic approaches, which Liz commented on as an overall tendency from an international point of view. And the books I have studied have a more or less visible aim to explain to the reader what transgender people go through. They educate by describing the experiences from the transgender character's perspective and also by introducing an appropriate vocabulary. And despite the good intentions, however, previous studies have shown that these kinds of books run the risk of objectifying trans bodies and stigmatizing transgender experiences. However, I argue that certain motifs and narrative choices can also have reparative functions. The key factor for this is narrative devices that evoke empathy, such as first-person narration and letting the characters reflect on the proper way to use pronouns and other technical terms, making it possible for the author to look with the transgender character and not at them, to borrow a line from Halberstam. Books about transgender children and youth tend to focus on problems related to being transgender, not only in Sweden, but also internationally, nationally, as you've heard. So the second category, books depicting transgender characters without problematizing their experiences, stand out. And as I argue in the chapter, they also have a potentially subversive function. The authors and illustrators make the conscious choice to leave the interpretation of the character's gender identity to the reader. And it is worth noting that some of these narratives are graphic novels that tell their stories through image sequences and dialogues in speech balloons, which means that the stories lack an external narrator, making third-person pronouns unnecessary. And this is actually a contributing factor to the story's abilities to represent the transgender characters without explicitly addressing the trans theme. So this makes them stand out from the overall corpus of transgender narratives in Sweden, but also to a large extent from an international viewpoint. So to conclude, in general, problematizing is favored as a strategy to achieve incorporation into the norm in Swedish transgender narratives, but we also see stories that break these scheme, stories that through their resistance to discussing the categories of gender at all can have a subversive function. Yeah, thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Åsa. And I would now like to introduce Patricia Sarles, who she has written a chapter on donor insemination in lesbian families. So this is one of our multinational chapters that compares and contrasts a large number of books from all across the world. So over to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Liz. I'm a librarian from the United States, and I believe that Thaddeus is as well. I've seen his name, I think, on listservs. And I got interested in this topic when my wife and I were starting the process of donor insemination in order to build our family, start getting pregnant. And in that process, we went to a fertility counselor. And at the same time, being a librarian, I read book reviews. And I happened to stumble upon, this was in 2003, I happened to stumble upon a book review in Booklist, Publishers Weekly, whatever, a book review of a book called Donut Head by Sue Stauffacher. It's a middle grade book about the main character is conceived via sperm donor by his single mother by choice. And I shared this with the fertility counselor. I said, you know, there's a book that just came out about a donor conceived character. And she said to me, and this changed the whole trajectory of my life. She said to me, can you find me more books like that? And I'm a gumshoe librarian. So I said, of course I can find you more books like that. And that confluence of events, trying to start the process of getting pregnant through sperm donation and reading a book review about a donor conceived character and this fertility counselor saying, can you find me more books like that, changed the whole trajectory of my life. And I've devoted the rest of the last 19 years to finding books on this topic. So my chapter is Heather Has a Donor, 30 years of international lesbian themed children's books on donor insemination. I examined books from 1989 to 2019. Since 2019, when I submitted my chapter to BJ and Liz, 3 more books have been published that are lesbian themed on donor insemination. Donor insemination is, if you don't know, donor conception is when a person, a heterosexual couple, a lesbian couple, or a gay couple have to resort to sperm donation, egg donation. You know, they borrow eggs or sperm from another person, a donor, in order to get pregnant and build a family. So I got my title, Heather Has a Donor, from the book Heather Has Two Mommies. A lot of people don't realize that the very first edition of the book, because it's been through so many editions, this may be why some people don't realize that the very first edition had a page where Mama Kate and Mama Jane went to the doctor, and one of them was inseminated, and that's how Heather was conceived. So Heather was the first main character of a children's book that was donor conceived, published in 1989 in the United States. And Leslie Newman received a lot of flack for that. And I've been in correspondence with Leslie Newman over the years, and I've asked her, you know, times have changed. Would you consider adding that back in? And she said, no, because the book is really about love in a family, and it's not really about donor insemination. And I agree with her on that. But that's how I got my chapter title. I examined 21 own voices children's books. Now, I don't know if own voice, hashtag own voices, is something that is used in the UK, in other parts of the world, but in the United States, hashtag own voices are books that are written by people who have actually experienced that. So there are 47 between 1989 and 2019, 47 lesbian themes kids books have been published. And I examined 21 own voices. So those are books that are written by actual lesbian mothers, where they wrote those books because they wanted to talk to their children or share with their children the story of how they came to be. So I examined books from Spain, Germany, France, Italy, Israel, Norway, the UK, Australia, and the USA. I translated all of the books myself. And this is except for the one from Israel, which was translated for me by the author, which I'm very grateful for. And this is research that I, like I said, have been doing since 2003. It's interesting how I got to know BJ, because I read an article in 2014 called We're Here, We're Not Queer, LGBT Characters in Children's Books, something like that. That was the title. And she examined a book called, from Sweden, called Malin's Mama, Gifter Sigmed Lisa. Malin's Mama Marries Lisa. And in that book, there's a scene where Malin's mama shares how she was conceived through donor sperm. And I had never heard of this book, and this was my research area. So I wrote to BJ, and BJ and I have been in touch ever since. And BJ graciously shared with me the photocopy she had of that book. I translated that book from Swedish to English using Google Translate. I'm not a Swedish speaker. And I added it to my list, and later found out from a publisher in Sweden who's in touch with the author, Annette Lundborg, that Annette Lundborg herself is a lesbian mother. I didn't know that. Lost my train of thought. That book was the second book ever published it wasn't about donor insemination. Neither was Heather Has Two Mommies, but they both have scenes in which the parents share with their children how they were conceived. And Malin's Mama Gifter Sigmund Lisa was published in 1999. So it was a full 10 years after Leslie Newman's Heather Has Two Mommies was published. So let me see. I want to share also, this was very important to me. When I read BJ's article in 2014, I want to share a quote from her article because it prompted me to write to her. Since there are many picture books teaching children about sex and how they were created, there is an argument to be made that there could be such books teaching children about heterosexual sex and the creation of babies in non-traditional stories. And this blew me away because I was like, oh my God, do I know about these books? Because I've been doing research on it for years. And then there's an American sociologist named Lisa Jean Moore, who wrote in an article, Billy the Sad Sperm. She writes origins, and this is very similar to what BJ wrote. Moore wrote, the origin story is not always true, and children who do not enter the world this way through heterosexual sex could be confused or shamed by reading it. When I began my research, I was interested to see if the pace of technological innovation and changing methods of conception had amended children's books' contents. And it's yes, there are books on the topic. Let me see. I think that's it, and I'm thrilled to take questions. This is the first scholarship on this topic, so I'm very proud of it. I am not a PhD, but just a librarian, but I'm the only one in the world doing research on this topic. So thank you all for listening.
Patricia, I have to correct you there when you say you're just a librarian, because that's such an important role. And there are at least 3 people here who are librarians. Librarians are wonderful, do an important job. But also, one of the things that was really important to me and Liz in working on this book was that the people who were contributing, like the comment there, never underestimated librarian, but we wanted to make sure that we had contributors some who are scholars who work at the university, some are activists, some are writers for children, librarians, and so on. And some do a combination of those things. So that was really important to us. And please, don't put yourself down in that way. So we now have, 15, 20 minutes for questions and comments. And there were a couple in the sort of Q&A box, one of which we've answered. And I think there was another one that I think Liz might have responded to. But if you want to sort of develop that more, we can. Did you want to say something?
Yes, I only responded insofar as to check whether it was a question for me, which I think it is, but I haven't actually answered it yet, so I'll do that now. So thank you very much for the question, which was, what was the rationale for the scoping or selection of the books that I analysed? So I was interested particularly in looking at recent books. Firstly, because I thought that bi books would be much more likely to exist more recently. Secondly, because the legal situation in France has over the first 2 decades of the 21st century steadily become more supportive of LGBTQ plus people, although I think it's important to acknowledge there that, as so often, trans rights have lagged behind rights for LGBT people. But because of this gradual improvement in sort of the social and cultural and legal background, I wanted to see whether that was reflected in terms of books existing and the content of the books. Because as BJ says in her previous monograph, Are the Kids All Right?, which I've actually got just here, she comments that very often the content of books or the existence of books does reflect social and cultural context. So I wanted to look at more recent books. I also restricted it to books published in France rather than any other French-speaking countries, because obviously that would be a different social and cultural context. So I basically looked for anything that had been published since 2010. And while I acknowledge it's possible I might have missed something, as far as I could find out, those 7 books were the only books with clearly bi characters or characters who could be obviously read as bi that were published within that time period. So I didn't do any selection once I had narrowed down the geographical setting and the timescale. That was a selection happened automatically just due to the small number of books available, which, as I say, is rather disappointing, but I think is starting to improve now. So yes, I hope that's answered your question, and thank you very much for it again.
Thanks, Liz. And I saw that we had a question actually from Anton, who is one of our contributors, and he wrote the chapter on South Korea. And it's great. Thank you so much, Anton. And you were asking actually about how we chose our contributors and how we found people. And yes, you said it was a mammoth task, and Liz can also answer this, but we wanted to try to get as big a geographical spread as possible. It was really important to us. If we were going to put international in the title, we wanted it to be international. But I don't think we'd anticipated just how difficult that was going to be, because we would reach out to people and some people said yes initially, and then would say, actually, the political situation is too challenging in my country. I don't want to put my name to it. So we had people who would say yes and then would pull out. We contacted people through the various IBIs, so the International Board on Books for Young People. We tried to contact as many of their kind of regional groups as possible. We also, Biggs were scholars, and Liz with her librarian sleuthing skills, we tried to find people who were working around the world on this topic. We used our own contacts. We posted in Facebook groups. I mean, in fact, I found Cheeno on Facebook, didn't I, Cheeno? By the way, our contributors, if you want to put your pictures on again, your videos on, I saw that you posted something about your own writing, and I thought, yes, I would like to have Cheeno be part of it. So we kind of did as much as we could to get people from around the world, but even so, we have to acknowledge that there are some gaps here. We really would have liked to have contributors from Africa, for example, and we have a chapter that's called the Arab world, which is a huge area of the world. And in the end, we couldn't get somebody who would write about any of the Arabic speaking countries and put their name to it. So we had somebody who contributed notes to us and said we could turn it into a short article. And of course, we did the sort of standard calls for papers as well. Did I miss something, Liz? Sorry, you should add to that.
I think that you have covered everything that I would have said in answer to that question, BJ. So thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you as well to everyone who tried to help us find contributors and get a range of contributors across the world. And I know at least one of them is here today. So just a quick shout out to Grania. Thank you very much for your efforts in trying to put us in touch with potential contributors. It was hugely appreciated.
Great. I think there was a question in the chat rather than in the Q&A. It was from Patricia, who's in Mexico, and you asked about, was it from you, Patricia, where you asked about the own voices? Yes, you are. You said you're interested in the own voices debate. Is this also something that is common in other countries beyond the United States? And so maybe some of our contributors would like to talk about what's going on in their countries or their understandings of it. Anybody? I mean, it's certainly a topic that we discuss here in the UK as well, the importance of having people write about their own lived experiences. And I think it's, it is very relevant to the work that we've done here in the book.
I think there has been some recent discussion, although again I think this has emerged from the US, but people are increasingly conscious of it in the UK as well, that particularly with regard to LGBTQ plus books, it can be potentially quite problematic to label this as this is an own voices book, this is not an own voices book. Because some people have been uncomfortably outed, some people have perhaps still been exploring their identity and then had people make assumptions about it. So that's just a sort of, I think it's still really important to consider the significance of lived experiences, but I'm just aware that that is kind of a new step in the debate that has emerged recently. But I don't know, I cannot speak to other countries, so I don't know whether any of our panelists would like to speak about that.
Åsa.
In Sweden, it's quite rare for authors or publishers to mention anything that regards queerness or if an author is transgender or gay or a lesbian and so on, in the information that is sent out together with the book. So most often you don't know, you don't have a clue, and there's different kinds of queer topics and queer aspects is so extremely common in Swedish children's and young adult literature. It's every other book. There is a gay subsidiary character, for instance. It's become extremely common. So I would say it would be really quite impossible for all the authors to be queer. And so in children's literature, this is not very much of a topic. And anyone can write queer narratives. It seems to be the general idea.
And that's interesting as well, if we're thinking about translation, because, if we're talking about, do you need to be queer to write these works? The next step is, do you also need to be queer to translate some of these works? And obviously that is a topic that's come up quite a lot recently in society, in the media. So we'll maybe watch this space and we'll be having this debate.
Yeah. Or do you need to be queer to study these books?
Absolutely. Yeah. Cheeno.
I think for other issues, other cultures in the Philippines, we really want to have the stories come from, for example, indigenous community. If you're writing about an indigenous community, you want it to come from themselves, because we want the stories to be as authentic as possible. But the problem with that is the issue of access and the issue of publication is more in the centers, in the cities, than in the peripheries. But I think the problem, I think in terms of writing as a queer person also, or representing who you are into your story, I think we are also not on that level just yet, because up to now there are still some stigma in the Philippines in terms of your gender identity. So many of us would write, but in the bio page, for example, we would not identify ourselves as belonging to a certain gender group. So
thank you. One thing that I would love to ask our panelists, but also people who are here attending in the audience, is whether there is a particular queer book from your culture, your language, that you would like to see translated to English or to other languages, something that you think is really worth people reading. And so while you have a chance to think about that, I would just say that I saw the comment from Anna about the Hungarian fairy tales, which sounds really interesting. But I think Lawrence Schimmel has been mentioned already today. He is a writer and translator in Spain, and some of the board books that he wrote were then translated to Hungarian. I think have been really controversial there, especially because of what you're talking about, the sort of far right situation. Oh, Osa, have you shared us some books that you think should be translated?
Here's a few. Perhaps the left one. If I'm going to choose one of them, I choose the left one. I write about all these books in my chapter. They're middle grade books from 6 to 9, 9 to 12-year-olds. The one to the left is about a girl, a transgender girl, who's coming out. It's also a the story is centered around a murder, so it's a sort of a crime story. It's very, very well written. It's 9 to 12. The middle book is about a trans boy and his life. They both and the one on the right is about it's about not a transgender. I'm losing the word. God. Hen.
Yes, well, yeah, so I guess non-binary.
But yeah, thank you, non-binary person. And that's, it's quite uncommon to have a protagonist for the age group 6 to 9 being non-binary, but it was released a couple of years ago. So there's 3 examples, quite recent, well-written examples. So there are quite a lot of, early on, there were a lot of publications that were self-made, but these are books from quality publishers, you could say. There's a lot from quality publishers in Sweden nowadays.
I think that's really important to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to say some of the books that I would really like to be translated are some of the picture books that Andrej spoke about in his chapter, particularly the ones by Alenka Spatzol, who did a wonderful cover. I'm just going to hold it up in the hope that you might be able to see it a bit more closely. But her book sounded like such a fascinating exploration of gender and different gender roles and different sexualities. And it's this beautiful mosaic style artwork, and it just, I can't think of anything quite like it that we have in English and all for children of that age. And also, I don't speak Slovenian, so I really want to be able to read it. So I would love to see those translated if any publishers are out there listening.
But it's a really important point. You know, we're talking about things we would like to see translated or changes we'd like to see to the publishing industry. And, you know, we need to be able to reach publishers. I mean, clearly there's a market of people who are interested in these works. So we need to encourage authors and illustrators to produce more of it, publishers to publish more of it. And then, of course, we need to translate more of it. So we have to wrap up in just a moment, but if there are any last comments or questions, if somebody would like to share what's going on with queer literature for young readers in your own country, whether it's homegrown, whether it's translated or both, what you would like to see changed or how the situation has changed since you were a young reader, you know, we'd be happy to hear any of that.
There is also one more question in the chat, BJ, which perhaps you might be best placed to answer.
Okay, I'll have a little look and then let's see. So Valentine has written that you're interested in translating nonfiction literature for YA. Do you have some useful bibliography to suggest to you? By bibliography, do you mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, I suppose. Books, you seem to have ideas for books you would, or do you mean books you think are worth translating to Italian? Do you think that's the question?
Or do you mean academic work on the actual process of translation?
Maybe
because obviously BJ has written quite a lot on translating for children and young people, so I would suggest her work as a first port of call.
No, thank you. Yes, well, and also, feel free to get in touch if you want a bit more information, but definitely there's more and more research being carried out on writing for children, translating for children. So it is a great time to be working in the field of children's literature. We've been seeing a lot of positive changes recently. I do feel that some of our sort of summaries of our findings were slightly negative, and some of the things that we've mentioned about maybe good intentions, but not necessarily well executed, that does sound negative. However, I think that we all are kind of in agreement that we're starting to see changes and that there are great things happening. And I, loved what Tad said about these works being there. They can unsettle ideas, they can be sort of protest, they can challenge colonization, they can challenge other kind of ideas and beliefs. And that's why we need more of it, more to show young people what queer lives and queer beliefs can be about. I suppose we should end here because it is, an hour and a half now, and that went by very quickly. But all I can do is say thank you so much to everybody for attending. Thank you to our contributors, our panelists, for being here and for being willing to talk about their work. Thank you to Duncan and Anna and Lily from the BCLT and UEA for hosting us. And thank you, of course, to Liz, my co-editor. It's been great having you all here. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'd just like to echo that and say thank you very much to everyone for being here. Thank you especially to our panelists today and to all our contributors. And thank you very much to our publisher, Anthem Press, and to BCLT for hosting. It's been a wonderful session. Thank you.
And it will be available on YouTube later, I understand, if you want to watch it or spread it.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.